Hi, my name is Rebecca Kemble. I'm the president of the board of directors of Towards Freedom. And thank you for coming to our webinar. Just a little bit about Toward Freedom. It's a magazine that was established on December 6th, 1952 by William B. Lloyd Jr. in Chicago, focusing on independence movements in Africa and anti-colonial struggles worldwide. Bill Lloyd helped to establish the Midwest Committee for Colonial Freedom at that same time. Towards Freedom was the only US publication to report on the Bandung Conference that launched the non-aligned movement. It covered independence processes throughout Africa and the rest of the world, with reporters and editors meeting with heads of state and movement leaders. Throughout its history, Towards Freedom has always stressed the critical role of independent media in world affairs, as well as free and open communication across national borders. Over 15 years ago, Toward Freedom transitioned from a print to a digital publication. Today, in the era of unprecedented media consolidation and financialization, Toward Freedom continues the legacy of anti-imperialism and independent media through our website, towardfreedom.org, where you can find hundreds of global reports from grassroots perspectives. Toward Freedom works hard to find and publish fresh voices as we work to support both new and seasoned journalists from all regions of the world. Our new editor, Julie Varughese, came on board earlier this year, having worked as a newspaper reporter, video producer, and communications professional in a variety of settings. Julie has been working with the Black Alliance for Peace since its inception, supporting their impressive growth over the past 4 years. Her strong writing, editing, video, graphics, and social media skills have strengthened Toward Freedom as we expand and grow to serve a broader, more diverse audience. Tonight, our webinar will feature Julie's report back from her recent trip to Nicaragua to cover the recent presidential elections, and 2 writers new to Toward Freedom that Julie has recruited, Danny Shaw and Jacqueline Luqman. Julie?
Thank you, everybody. My name is Julie Varughese, as Rebecca said, and I am very happy to be the new editor here at Toward Freedom. Toward Freedom made the decision to send me to Nicaragua because of the fact that the corporate media was spending so much of its time, I would say, yeah, if you can expand the screen. And the corporate media was spending so much of its time actually kind of saying that the elections would be rigged in Nicaragua, even before the elections happened in Nicaragua. For example, they were saying that they were talking about the elections way back in June. So this is our first big effort since I came on board to go to Nicaragua. And next slide. So I went to Nicaragua on a delegation that was organized by the Friends of the ATC. The ATC stands for the Asociación de Trabajadores del Campo, or in English, Rural Workers Association. The Rural Workers Association, the Friends of the ATC, is an autonomous organization in Nicaragua. It has 50,000 members who are small farmers and farm workers. And this is the campus you see here of the Friends of the ATC, where they have their school for peasants. Next slide. So this is the school for, it's the Francisco Morazan International Peasant Workers School on this campus here. It's maybe a half an hour from Managua, the capital. And this used to be the house of a military general who worked under the dictatorship of Anastasio Somoza, who ended up being overthrown in 1979 by the Sandinista Popular Revolution, which was led by peasants who were part of a party that was formed in 1962 called the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, or the FSLN, which in English would be the Sandinista National Liberation Front. So the FSLN, as they're popularly known, they're also called Sandinistas. Sandinista comes from the name of a Nicaraguan national hero named Augusto Sandino. From 1979 to 1989 is what is considered the revolutionary period. And in 1984, the FSLN held elections, and at the FSLN won. Daniel Ortega became the president at that point. In 1989, though, he lost the presidency to the daughter of a landowning family. Her name was Violeta Chamorro. Then from 1990 to 2006 was 16 years of what they call the neoliberal period. During that time, presidents were elected who essentially served US interests, and they rolled back a lot of Sandinista reforms, such as land reform, healthcare, education. In 2006, Daniel Ortega won again. The FSLN won again in a surprise victory. So from then on, the FSLN has governed the country, and many of the reforms have been re-implemented. Next slide. Next slide. So in Nicaragua, because it's the global south, it's a warm country. The outdoors and the indoors are very much connected. So there's lots of plants all around you. Next slide. The country produces 80% of the food that it eats. So it has food sovereignty, and that's a big deal for such a small country, and for a country that is in the crosshairs of the United States. And that means that when sanctions hit Nicaragua, it doesn't starve ordinary people, which is a big deal, because that's how kind of color revolutions and subversions start, is with disturbing ordinary people's lives and preventing them from eating and drinking and whatnot. So next slide is, we visited one farm, at least one farm. This one here is called San Jose de los Rios, or San Jose of the Rivers. They grew about a dozen fruits, including coffee. And this was once a plantation where they were slaves. And these farmers now own the land that they were once slaves on, if you can imagine that. So the peasants and the workers and the farmers in this country make up the base of Nicaragua's population. And therefore, if you can imagine the kind of, I guess they're just very strong and very concerned about keeping their independence and their autonomy, and never having a situation again where they are slaves on plantations. Next slide. And here we were given a tour of their farm. So it was very hilly, so you have to walk up and down the hillsides. It takes a lot of, you need to be very strong, or at least not have any injuries in order to do this. Next slide. There's lots of animals all around. It's just a normal part of life. Dogs, birds, turkeys, iguanas, you name it. Next slide. Nicaraguans are very proud of their history and what their country has achieved, even if they don't all agree with their government. This here is a lagoon that Somoza, the dictator, used to throw dissidents into, and this lagoon is directly opposite the presidential palace, which now isn't even being used. It burned at one point during the revolution. Next slide. So election weekend, we went to Nicaragua. I went to Nicaragua to cover the elections for Toward Freedom. And next slide. We first needed to get accredited. That was the beginning of the weekend. So that required that, we have our pictures taken, give our ID, they make badges for us. And then for the rest of the weekend, we were wearing those badges. And so everybody around us knew that we were accredited election companions. There were 232 election companions. Next slide. And of the 232 election companions, 67 of us were accredited press. Here was on Saturday, the day before the election, we were in a conference center where we were given reports from ministries of from all different departments, and election companions came from as far away as Russia and China, from 27 countries around the world, and 70 of the election companions were from the United States. And next slide. I'm sorry, no, go back actually. And the ministries made a point of giving reports on health, economy, foreign investments, education, COVID-19, and the attempted 2018 coup. And that attempted coup in 2018 devastated Nicaragua's economy to the point that it took them 3 years to get back to what would be like normal, or GDP growing, not stagnating or declining. So, but then right as their GDP was growing and going into the positive, the pandemic hit. And they made a point of not putting their nation into a lockdown because they said that their country is too small to withstand a lockdown. So they instead implemented a program of going door to door, talking to people about the pandemic, about hand washing, about wearing masks, and and social distancing, and they actually have the lowest rate of deaths to COVID-19 in the whole Western Hemisphere. And also they have much lower deaths compared to their neighbors like Costa Rica or Honduras. And they called us election companions because some years back when the OAS and the EU sent election observers, they actually said that the elections were, weren't good enough, that there was some fraud, etc. And because to avoid that kind of scenario, what they did instead was to call all of us election companions, so that the authority for us is there's no authority, and we don't have authority. We're just checking it out. Basically, we're accompanying the elections is how they related to us. We're not observing the elections and telling them or telling the world what we see, and then using that to subvert the process. So we were election companions. And next slide. So I wrote a couple of articles about debunking myths about Election Day, and because the corporate media was really going in hard between the New York Times and the Democracy Now!, we felt the need to figure out kind of, we can, as people who think critically, we can say, obviously the corporate media lies about countries and their processes, but it's nice to be there on the ground. So next slide. I went on the ground to check it out, and it's really interesting to get the perspective. It's like you're getting it's like a materialist perspective, you can say. It's like you can talk about it, but when you actually go there, it's different. So here is an example of a voting center. They were all held at schools for the most part, and their schools are open air kind of scenarios where they have courtyards. So each classroom was one voting station. And this one here, some of us were sent, we were all sent to different cities in Nicaragua. We're all split up as election companions. And I was sent in a group to Chinandega, which is a city in the Pacific Northwest of Nicaragua, which is a Sandinista stronghold. And the reason it's a Sandinista stronghold is because when the 2018 attempted coup happened, they saw what was happening in Managua with all of the devastation, the violence, the disruption, and a lot of, not only disruption, but vandalism. So to avoid that, they just basically defended their city, and they didn't allow any of the coup makers to come into Chinandega. And so that's since then been a very strong, a stronghold for the Sandinistas. Now, and they also built a $100 million hospital in Chinandega that they were very proud of as well. And voting took place, in the United States, you heard stories of people spending 8 hours on a line or 11 hours on a line in the hot sun waiting to vote. But here in Nicaragua, the whole process would take between 5 and 10 minutes to vote. You walk in and you walk out. Next slide. They had hand washing stations. This was like in the middle of the courtyard for the school. Next slide. So they only had campaigning according to their rule or their law in their country. Every country has their laws about elections and campaigning. In Nicaragua, it's only 2.5 months for campaigning. For example, like in the UK, there's only 6 weeks for campaigning. In the United States, there's no limit. So in Nicaragua, there's 2.5 months to campaign from August 21st to November 3rd. And they also didn't allow any rallies. The corporate media was saying, oh, they're suppressing the presidential candidates. They're not letting them to do any rallies, but actually they didn't allow large rallies all across the board for all campaigns, for all presidential candidates because of COVID-19 restrictions. Next slide. So we were given orientations at every voting station, at every voting center that we went to. We went to 4 voting centers, and we were given orientations by election workers at each one. And they also, next slide. So Nicaragua took 1 year to prepare for the elections. That included making voter identification for voters. People, if you wanted to vote, you had to register to vote. You had to get your special ID for it. And that ID is only used for voting, not for driving a car or for anything else. And next slide. So on the ballot, not only do you see 6 parties, you know, the corporate media said that no parties were allowed to run except for the FSLN. Well, 6 parties were on the ballot. 5 of them were against the FSLN. And interestingly enough, there were photos of each of the presidential candidates on the ballot to make it easier. And you hear these stories in the United States of people always saying on election day, I was confused, I didn't know who I was voting for. But here, it's really a lot less likely you're going to be confused because the photos of the candidates are on the ballot. Next slide, thank you. And voter rolls were found on the computer. Next slide. And on paper, the neon green paper you see plastered on the wall on the right side is the paper version of what's on the computer. Next slide. So they could have, you know, if people had problems with the election at the polls, like the corporate media was saying, people were having issues, there was violence. If all of this was the case, because we're all wearing badges and some of us were wearing those vests that indicated that we were election companions. So if you're seeing us walking around with badges and or these vests on, you know that we're from another country, we're there to observe or to accompany the elections. You would think that people would run up to us and say, hey, there's all these issues with the election, please help us. But it turned out nobody ran up to us. There was it was just a really peaceful process all throughout. It was very organized. People were very proud of their elections, of the voting process in the country, regardless of their party affiliation. Next slide. People, again, 5 to 10 minutes to get through and vote. And they're all given instructions on how to vote. Next slide. And at the end of voting, they get their thumb painted with ink so that everyone knows that they voted and there's no way to do so-called fraud like the way that they always talk about in the United States with voting here. Next slide. And then just more people with their thumbs painted. Everybody got their thumbs painted. Next slide. The local press was following us everywhere because we were election companions from outside of the country. Next slide. They interviewed a lot of us for their TV stations and their publications. Next slide. It was a very orderly process and it was a very calm process, very festive. Outside of the, outside in the courtyard area, people were just hanging out, just having fun. It wasn't, there was not much to, it was just a good time. You would think that if there was fraud or if people had issues, they would just run up to us or that there wouldn't be a festive environment, but it was a very calm and orderly. Next slide. Just more of just kind of what you saw. Next slide. More of the voting and very orderly. People are just sitting around afterward if they wanted to. Next slide. People waiting online again. Next slide. Interestingly enough, in Nicaragua, they have a program in place to help people who are elderly or have disabilities to vote. So like you hear often in the United States of people with disabilities complaining that they couldn't vote because the people at the poll just wouldn't let them, or they didn't have the capacity to help them. But here they would help people get upstairs if they needed to get to their voting station. And next slide. This lady was carried upstairs, and then the actual voting, the little booth was brought to her. Next slide. And then she was helped to get back into a rickshaw to go back home. And it was just a whole process. Like they carried her up the stairs, they carried her down the stairs. And they had no problem with this. This is election workers helping people. This is part of their process. This is their program in place to help and ensure that everybody gets a chance to vote regardless of their physical status. Next slide. And then off she went back home, and that was it. And next slide. By 3 a.m. that morning, so we basically stayed up all night in the conference center waiting for the election results to come in. Preliminary results came close to 3 a.m. and it said that the FSLN had won. Daniel Ortega would remain as president. And this here is the Supreme Electoral Council. They're made up of representatives of all of the political parties in the country. So again, the corporate media says that people in Nicaragua, that the whole thing is rigged, but if it was rigged, they wouldn't have an electoral council where all the parties are represented. And this electoral council is the fourth branch of the government. Whereas in the United States, there's 3 branches only. Here in Nicaragua, there's 4 branches. One of them is the electoral council itself. Next slide. So it was really nice to be on the ground because you got to actually see like kind of how things ran and speak to people. And next slide. And at the end of the day, this is the people's process. This is Nicaraguans. Nicaraguans, the majority of them are peasants, they're workers, they're farm workers, and they're very proud of this process. And even if they were not in favor of the Sandinistas, they still were proud of what was going on in Nicaragua. And they opposed US sanctions, they opposed US meddling, and they just wanted to live in peace. So, and next slide. And if you want to learn more, if you want to read the articles that I wrote that detail all these things that happened that I saw, you can go to towardfreedom.org. There's 2 articles on there right now. And thank you very much for your time. So Danny Shaw teaches Latin American and Caribbean studies and race and ethnicity, class and gender at the City University of New York. He holds a master's degree in international affairs from the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. He is fluent in Spanish, Haitian Creole, Portuguese, Cape Verdean Creole, and has a fair command of French. Danny Shaw works as an international affairs analyst for Telesur, RT, and other international news networks. He has worked and organized in 70 different countries, opening his spirit to countless testimonies about the inhumanity of the international economic system. Danny Shaw also is a Golden Gloves boxer, fighting twice in Madison Square Garden for the New York City Heavyweight Championship. He teaches boxing, yoga, and nutrition, and works as a sober coach. A senior research fellow at the Council on Hemispheric Affairs, he works to keep young people out of the military and prison industrial complex. He is a mentor to many, guiding them through the nutritional, ideological, social, and emotional landmines that surround us. He is the father of 2 young life warriors. Danny Shaw is the author of 6 books and has authored blogs and articles on Latin American history, boxing, and nutrition, among other topics. Welcome, Danny.
Thanks, Julie. Anti-imperialist greetings. Beautiful to be among community. Reading all the comments, super inspirational from around the country and in the world. I just returned from Haiti, the Dominican Republic. I was with the Haitian community in the Dominican Republic and in Venezuela. So I'll go country by country with an update. And so beautiful. Thanks, Julie, Rebecca. A refreshing, very vibrant view of Nicaragua, the polar opposite of what CNN and all these pro-war networks feed us all day, every day. And to see toward freedom's consistent anti-imperialist coverage all these decades, from the Bandung Conference through the height of the misnamed Cold War, the global class struggle, and how it played out so cruelly in Angola, in Nicaragua, in the Caribbean, and that they never contextualize that the Nicaraguan people are the true anti-imperialist heroines and heroes who continue to resist and defy empire. So in Haiti, things are very intense right now. Water, gasoline right now for 1 gallon is at $11. Bringing the economy almost to a halt. The G9, the Confederation of Nine Gangs, had blockaded gas. The main gas distribution centers are sandwiched between two massive oppressed communities, ghettos, Cité Soleil and Cité Militaire. And who was most impacted, of course, is the everyday Haitian people. So there's a massive water crisis right now in Fort National, Solino, in the everyday communities, the working class. Haiti is historically a peasant country, but because of so many years of colonialism and neocolonialism, 2.5 million Haitians have been pushed into the shanty towns of Port-au-Prince. There's a turf war, a gang war, a proxy war that is playing out. And who's trapped in the middle? It's the everyday Haitian families, many young people. And these are the types of voices that we're trying to project and translate. Many young people are trapped in this proxy war. Many are forced to flee to the Dominican Republic or try to make it to Miami. The Haitian good is at 100 Haitian goods right now for $1 US. But the Haitian people continue to understand and project that their main enemy is in Miami and is in Washington. That if Haiti were just left alone to determine its own destiny, Haiti could overcome centuries and centuries of colonialism and neocolonialism. Reparations is a main concept that the Haitian people constantly talk about. Shifting now to the Dominican Republic. Officially, there's about 500,000 Haitians in DR. Unofficially, there's, I'd say, hundreds of thousands more. The Dominican government, there's been an uptick in the xenophobic, Trump-like fascist atmosphere, extreme violence against Haitian students. There were raids on clinics in Los Minas and other popular neighborhoods where Haitian women who were pregnant or had just given birth were specifically targeted to be deported. So with the Dominican leadership and progressive journalists, we were able to go to the different jails and try to do our best to talk to the everyday Haitian people, but it's reminiscent of the Jim Crow South and of the entire USA today in terms of repression of voices. Haitians couldn't speak on camera. In Haiti Chiquito, the little Haiti of Santo Domingo and San Carlos. So it was difficult to get the voices out, these necessary voices. In the Dominican people, there's a certain, of course, I'm not engaging in any types of generalizations, but similar to white America, not all of white America, but a great chunk of working class white America, much of my family included, we've been so filled up with backwardness and chauvinism and American exceptionalism you can't talk about Haitian food and Haitian, just everyday Haitian things, culture and music and in voodooism, your Haitian spirituality in DR, because the informational war is so strong. And the way the Haitian leadership was building with me on February 7th, when the anti-neocolonial, anti-Jovenel Moïse rebellion broke out, and we're going to show a clip of that rebellion now, just in the spirit of independent journalism and in a tribute to all the great work. Every semester, I give my students a list of independent media outlets, from the Gray Zone to Liberation News to workers.org, and of course, Towards Freedom is now on the top of that list. A huge part of this, Fidel Castro called it a battle of ideas, is for people to understand that Haiti's never been poor. Haiti's always been exploited. And like Nicaragua, like all of Central America, Haiti has been punished, in the words of Eduardo Galeano, not because of its poverty, but because of its immense wealth. So to actually dialogue with the Haitian American, the Haitian American community, Haitians themselves, and to project that Haiti has immense wealth, from the sea to the seafood, to the mountains, to the rural areas. Of course, Black Agenda Report is on the list. I just caught a comment there from Ajam. Yeah, I didn't list the whole list, but all the classics are on there. So yeah, Rebecca, we can roll that clip just to bring people on the ground. How does the class struggle play out every day in Haiti, from the times of Duvalier to the FRAP, Democrat or Republican, as the Haitians say, two wings of the same buzzard, of the same vulture. In Venezuela, the problem is the wrong people keep winning, according to white supremacy and US imperialism. That's what they can't forgive about the Bolivarian Revolution, the victory of Hugo Chavez in 1998. There's been 29 elections in the past 22 years in Venezuela. So I was there in the same capacity as Julie in Nicaragua, is an election compañero, an election companion. And to see the democracy from the humble sectors of the Venezuelan population, a country of 30 million, more than 6 million who were forced out by the 2015 Obama sanctions. And now they're heightening sanctions against Nicaragua, the stranglehold on the Bolivarian project of unity and integration. And this democracy is a people's democracy. So when you go to Venezuela, we get to visit all of the popular strongholds. I think one misconception about, we can go to Haiti now, and then I'll finish up. I think it's
Here we have a march of tens of thousands approaching, and this is very symbolic of Haiti, Haitian history, Haitian class society 101. Here we have a police blockade. The police have taken their position. Nobody can pass by Del Mao, because on the other side of these massive police vehicles and this police repression, we have the other Haiti. We have the Haiti of Pétionville, the Haiti of Belleville, the Haiti of the 0.001%. So this is a very symbolic point where the police are already getting the tear gas, the bullets ready. And as we can see, beyond the smoke here, you have approaching the 99.9%, the masses of Haitian people demanding to defend the 1987 Constitution, demanding an end to the US-sponsored OAS, United Nations-sponsored dictatorships, which have continually pillaged, exploited, invaded, and occupied Haiti. I hope that these videos can reach diaspora yo too, pour yo ka comprendre situation pays ya, because a lot of Haitian Americans have stood with Biden, Trump, Obama, Bush, Clinton, in the massacres in Cité Soleil, the massacres in Bel Air. So here we have a very symbolic point of confrontation.
And how many massacres in Haiti have occurred just because the people rose up historically. As Ajama was pointing out, the demonstrations have dissipated on some level. July 7th, the assassination of this neoliberal puppet Jovenel Moïse became a carte blanche for other factions of the Haitian bourgeoisie and their foreign sponsors to repress Haitian rebellion, but it's still ongoing. So just to finish with Venezuela in my last minute in 30 seconds, yeah, there were opposition candidates, opposition participation, the international delegations, the European Union was out in full force to sit down with these opposition candidates. Certainly the second kidnapping of Alex Saab, who's now confined to a jail cell in Miami and courtrooms in Georgia. We should all be aware of the Freedom for Alex Saab campaign. This was another attempt to sabotage participation. This resulted in the suspension of talks in Mexico City between the opposition and the Bolivarian leadership. 41.8% of the Venezuelan electorate participated in these midterm elections, which is much larger than often participate in US midterm elections. The opposition won 3 states, including a border state with Colombia, which is extremely important because it's through Colombia and the US's 9 military bases and the 11 illegal US military bases in Panama, and now a creeping US military presence in the neoliberal Ecuador of Guillermo Lasso, that they can surround and envelop the Bolivarian project. And that's what they're afraid of, to end with this idea of continental integration, the project of Walter Rodney, so many of our forefathers and foremothers. The future for Haiti doesn't have to go through DC and Miami. The future of Haiti can go through Caracas and Managua, in this incredible victory of the Honduran people right now. Though the US's largest military base in the continent is the Soto airfields in Honduras. So Xiomara Castro and the anti-imperialist alliance in Honduras have a lot of work in front of them, similar right now to Peru, where the class struggle is playing out in the summits of Peruvian political power. And they're doing everything to impeach Pedro Castillo, who thus far has been more of a Bernie Sanders-esque type president, quite timid because the right wing is so strong. So many are predicting that Xiomara Castro could be up against a similar type of presence in Honduras. I'll leave it there for now.
Danny, that was excellent. And that video was really great too. I think we used it also in an article that you did for us for on Haiti toward freedom. So thank you so much for that. So I'm going to Rebecca, once we can get Jacqueline's video started, I'm going to read Jacqueline's bio here. So Jacqueline Luqman is a radical left political commentator who co-hosts the radio show By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik. She is also a member of the Black Alliance for Peace Outreach Committee and a member of Pan-African Community Action, a member organization of the Black Alliance for Peace. In all of these roles, Jacqueline draws on her anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, Pan-African revolutionary ideals to analyze and critique the current political and social issues and events and situate them in the context of their meaning and impact on marginalized and oppressed communities struggling and the ongoing struggle for liberation domestically and internationally. Welcome, Jacqueline.
Thank you so much for including me on this panel. Revolutionary greetings to everyone. I'm very honored to be a contributor to Toward Freedom with such a long history of anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, independent journalism, and I'm very appreciative to be on this panel. I'm not sure how I'm supposed to follow Danny Shaw up, but I'm gonna try. I love movies, and probably too much television, but I do love movies. So my contribution toward freedom is appropriately film reviews, because I love movies, and because people often think of movies as just entertainment. But when we remember or understand, for those who do not know, that Hollywood is the propaganda arm of the US military, and by extension, it's the propaganda arm of the domestic law enforcement apparatus and of US militarism and imperialism abroad, then we realize that movies are not just entertainment at all. To be clear on the role that the US military and the CIA have been involved in with American movies and television shows, you should know that right now, and for at least 1945, if any filmmaker in this country wants to have representation of US military equipment in their movies or television shows, or they want to recreate locations of military actions in their films or shows, the script has to be approved by the Pentagon in order for military equipment and military bases to be used as props, right down to the body armor and the weaponry. So what does this mean in terms of the movies that we watch? Well, here's one example that I'm sure we can all relate to. The movie franchise Transformers, with all of the military equipment in those franchises. Yes, the Pentagon approved those scripts and provided the equipment for the Hollywood studios to rent. If a filmmaker makes a movie about war, it has to be approved by the Pentagon, so that the narrative that is approved by the Pentagon about the events in that war aren't like covered over by pesky things called facts. For example, there was a 2002 movie called Wind Talkers about US Marine Joe Enders, who was assigned to protect Navajo code talker Private Ben Yazzie during World War II. And that movie was only approved by the Pentagon after its director, John Woo, who is one of my favorite actors, made 3 changes to the script that the Pentagon demanded that he make. One was that he could not show in the movie any US soldiers looting the gold teeth of fallen Japanese soldiers. That was considered too brutish. Second, the film couldn't have Enders slaughtering Japanese soldiers who had surrendered. That was considered too brutish. And third, a scene of a higher ranking officer ordering Enders to kill Private Yazzie in the event that he, Private Yazzie, was captured by the Japanese had to be removed, because, you know, that would be so mean. But the thing is, all 3 of these incidents actually happened. There's documented evidence of these war crimes, because that's what they are, actually occurring with Enders and Private Yazzie, but the Pentagon considered these depictions inconsistent with the military's guiding ethos. So you have to wonder, what is the US military's guiding ethos? But it's not just the Pentagon that is involved in the approval of narratives in US movies. It's also the CIA, and honestly, every intelligence agency in this country. The CIA has had a hand in the production of movies and television shows like Black Hawk Down, the television show The Americans, another one of my favorites. And if you couldn't have already guessed it, the Showtime series Homeland, which is actually based on an Israeli series called Prisoners of War. And interestingly enough, the creator of the Israeli series, Prisoners of War, revolves around 3 Israeli prisoners of war who were captured on a secret mission in Lebanon. And the creator of that series is also a co-developer of the Homeland series in the United States. So you've got an Israeli propagandist co-developing and contributing to an American series about national security that the CIA is also contributing to. So you know that in the US series Homeland, every Arab is a terrorist, torture is justified, and the US is innocently defending itself from foreign attackers who they haven't done a thing to and are all just looking for justice in the pursuit of national security. But the reason the US is meddling in the affairs of other countries in the first place is never disclosed in Homeland, just like it's never disclosed in the original series Prisoners of War why Israeli agents were in Lebanon in the first place. So when we understand the depth of the Pentagon and the CIA and the FBI's involvement, NSA's involvement in movies and television in the US, we shouldn't still be thinking that any movie is merely entertainment as much as we might enjoy them. And like I said, I love movies. And that's doubly, maybe exponentially true for any movie that documents Black struggle in this country. And I specify this country in particular because maybe, at least for me, one of the greatest problems with films in the US that try to claim to document Black struggle, especially films depicting the lives of notable figures in the Black struggle, the long history of Black struggle in this country, is that the stories are limited to involvement in the struggle in the US alone, right? Now, thinking of like many people's favorite movie about one such figure, Malcolm X, Spike Lee's Malcolm X. Aside from the many departures from the autobiography of Malcolm X that the director Spike Lee takes in the film, and there are many, the only international connection that is depicted in that movie that Malcolm X had was his pilgrimage to Mecca. And we remember in that movie, it was there that we're supposed to believe that Malcolm was miraculously enlightened to realize that all people weren't actually devils. And then he came back to the US a changed and less angry man. As entertaining as the movie was and is, it is actually the farthest thing from the truth. And more egregious to me from the departure from the historical account of in the autobiography of Malcolm X and the artistic license that Spike Lee takes with the movie, this lack of the international connections that Malcolm X had, particularly in Africa, is even more egregious to me, because Malcolm traveled to Africa in 1959 while he was still with the Nation of Islam, visiting Ghana, Sudan, and Nigeria on behalf of Elijah Muhammad. And there's nothing in the movie really about his extensive travels around the continent after his pilgrimage to Mecca. And there's nothing in the movie about him meeting with Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, with Egypt's Gamal Nasser, and with Algeria's Ahmed Ben Bella. Why is this important? Because all of those men were not only Pan-Africanists, but they also wanted to work with Malcolm upon his return to the US to further global Pan-African unity. And in fact, it was the Organization of African Unity, organized chiefly by Kwame Nkrumah, that inspired Malcolm to form the Organization of Afro-American Unity, the OAAU, upon his return to the US to fight for human rights of Black people here and to foster unity with Africans and all people of African descent around the world. Malcolm even returned to Egypt 2 months later after he started the OAAU in New York to the second Organization of African Unity meeting as a representative of the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And even though Spike Lee's movie about Malcolm X doesn't make much of his efforts to strengthen Pan-African unity, The important thing about the omission of this information from that movie is that the FBI took a great deal of notice of it in real life. Because ahead of Malcolm's trip to Africa, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover wrote in a memo dated July 2nd, 1964, that the OAAU was a threat to the national security of the United States. And the FBI even wanted to convict Malcolm under the Logan Act, which forbids negotiating with foreign governments having a dispute with the United States. Now, I focused so much on Malcolm X, that movie, because its director is Black. And I hope that's an example, that's a good example, I think, that we can't always trust directors who are not white to tell the story of Black struggle in this country, or the people involved in Black struggle in this country accurately either. As much as we can't trust the Pentagon and the CIA and the NSA and the FBI from altering movie scripts to present the narrative of empire. Look at the focus on the informant that the movie Judas and the Black Messiah had, right? Now, of course, the purpose of the movie was to tell the story of the informant. I mean, the movie is called Judas and the Black Messiah. But we learn very little about the actual revolutionary politics, especially the internationalism of Fred Hampton and the Black Panther Party, which is part of the problem with that movie in particular, and the movies about Black struggle in this country that are produced by Hollywood in general. They may tell a part of the story of struggle in the US, but they rarely reveal how Black leaders and Black people have almost always connected our struggles to working class and poor people around the world in solidarity, and that is by design. The other thing I think that too many movies about real life struggle in the US does is to convey this tone of syrupy conciliation, right? But heavily on the side of Black people who need to understand, the racist white people. We need to understand the unjust legal system. We need to understand, the horrors of enslavement and its legacy. It's over now, and we need to understand these brutal killer cops, and we need to stop being so angry and just understand. The idea that's conveyed in too many movies about Black struggle in this country is that if Black people, the people who are oppressed and are struggling for our freedom, liberation, rights, and humanity in this country, were more patient and understanding about how confused and just misguided individual racist people are, that those individual racist people would suddenly soften their hearts and be better. The golden rule and all that kind of stuff. But that is bull, of course. And in a few, if any of these movies is the entire system of white supremacist capitalism ever discussed or mentioned, so it's never indicted, it's never called into question. So Black struggle in this country in regard to the movies that are supposed to focus on Black struggle is always relegated to a few, awful, hard-hearted white people, as opposed to the systemic and foundational rot of racialized capitalism and inhumane barbarity that is at the very root of the establishment of the colonies on this soil, that includes the near genocide of the Native American people, and the growth and prosperity of this country and the expansion of US militarism and imperialism around the world. Why is this a problem? Too many people get their information about our history from these movies. As I said, I love movies. I love watching movies. I love going to the movies and the movie experience. But we have to be clear that movies, even documentaries sometimes, have gaping holes in their narratives as far as what the truth is, the actual history of how things happened. Like, do you notice whenever you see a movie about World War II in this country, it's always that the United States won the war and never about the Red Army. That's by design. But the same country that never tells the truth about who actually won World War II and defeated the Nazis, it was not the US, it actually was the Soviet Army, the Red Army, is the very same country that spins these narratives about countries and leaders like Nicaragua, calling their leaders communist, evil communist dictators, like Honduras, calling their leaders evil communist dictators. The entire US military imperialist project in Latin America was and is all about really stealing the resources from those people, but it was all shrouded in this narrative of anti-communism, the Red Scare. And so much of the political and police repression of Black people struggling for our liberation in this country and around the world today is also centered around smearing Black people with the tag of communists, just as they did during the civil rights movement and before. Because remember, Martin Luther King Jr. was supposed to be a communist too. So independent media like Toward Freedom fills those gaping holes and corrects the narrative about these representations in popular media about real life struggles that we are going through in this country. I am not at all advocating that we should stop watching movies, because I don't think I can stop watching movies. I'm not saying that we should stop watching television shows. Not sure that I can do it for a long period of time. What I am saying is that we need to remember that entertainment, all of it, all entertainment is propaganda. And we have to be very clear that Hollywood is in bed with the Pentagon, or Pentagon is in bed with Hollywood, however you like to frame it. And the US military industrial complex, the US imperialist government, the capitalist government of this country, the militaristic juggernaut that is the US, the white supremacist, racialized capitalism that is this country and its imperialist doctrine and global hegemony is the narrative. And really that is the power behind what kind of movies get approved in Hollywood and what those movies and the ideas that those movies convey. And it doesn't matter what kind of movie it is, if it's comedy, if it's a war documentary, even if it's a horror movie. And I think one of the few examples of a movie that escaped that kind of ideological propaganda control of Hollywood and the Pentagon was, interestingly, Candyman. And I did do a review of the sequel, that recent movie, In Toward Freedom. I was surprised by that movie. But there are few movies about Black struggle in this country like Candyman that are very clear. And interestingly, it's a horror movie, but it is so steeped in the reality of our struggle that it might as well be almost a documentary, almost a very serious movie. But there are so few movies that are as clear and honest in its ideology, I think, as Candyman. Even documentaries, that I think we always have to be on guard as anti-capitalists, as anti-imperialists, as Pan-Africanists, honestly, as I am myself, and as people who are committed to international solidarity with working class and oppressed people around the world against the imperialist hegemony of the United States and the West, that as we're watching these movies, we have to keep in mind who's controlling what we see on the screen. It is not the screenwriters. It is not the directors. It's not the technical advisors. It is the Pentagon, the CIA, the FBI, the NSA. It is the US capitalist imperialist system that's producing our entertainment. So without independent media like Toward Freedom, we wouldn't know the truths that are hidden in the cracks or covered over behind some of the worst movie propaganda in the US that is passed off as just entertainment. So I'm very, very proud of my contribution as a film critic to Toward Freedom, because I think that critiquing film entertainment from an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, Pan-Africanist, international solidarity lens is just as important as the work of actually being 10 toes on the ground, boots in the streets, radical struggle is. We all have a place in this struggle, and I'm very, very proud to do my part. Thank you so much, and watch a good movie soon.
And I just wanted to thank everybody in the comments, everybody from the Friends of the ATC. I see all of you in the comments. I know some of you couldn't stay because of a goodbye party that's happening in Nicaragua. I also wanted to thank everybody in the comments from Black Alliance for Peace, as well as the Black Alliance for Peace Solidarity Network. And we are going to move into the Q&A portion of the this webinar. So there are some questions in the Q&A box. First one was, how long is the voting period? That's referring to Nicaragua. It went from 7 a.m. in the morning on November 7th until 6 p.m. that evening. So that was 11 hours. And then Tom Violette asks, were candidates prevented from appearing on the ballot in Venezuela? Maybe Danny, you can answer that question really quick.
Yeah, sure thing. There was participation from the Venezuelan opposition. The Venezuelan opposition has been fractionalized over the years, very corrupt opposition. The Juan Guaido faction has how much of Venezuela's wealth in their own coffers, in their own bank accounts, the $2 billion of Venezuelan gold held up by the Bank of England and PDVSA and in Citgo across the US. So some factions of the opposition did not participate, but much did. It's interesting now because the European Union was there in full force with dozens and dozens of observers that we kept bumping into and trying to interact with, but they were pretty quiet. But they're recognizing now they're done with the exhausted Juan Guaido puppet project, but the US continues, and we're going to see what happens in 2022 because Juan Guaido has no base, has nothing except some of his elite friends in the east of Caracas. So what will happen in this upcoming year?
Thank you, Danny. So that's really interesting to hear about the EU observers and just kind of how people really are really done with Juan Guaido. So there was another question in the Q&A, but now it's gone. No, Robin answered it, but let me just say it out loud. So Nefa Freeman said, what can each of you say about Americanism, in quote marks, as Malcolm X referred to it, as a psychological assault on the domestic populace in the US, the identification with the settler colonial establishment, and why or why not is it important to break from, also how it can be done. But before we get to that, Robin Lloyd, who is one of the board members, she's also the daughter of the founder of this publication, she asked, how can 15 white people be hidden in Haiti without Tele Bio revealing where they are? Is this a game? So I think the question about, maybe really quickly, if you can answer Robin's question, I'm not really clear on what she's referring to, maybe Danny?
Yeah, so the 17 missionaries who were kidnapped by Kasama Wuzo, 400 idiots would be the translation. Weird name for a gang. 2 were released for health reasons last week. When we talk about kidnapping in Haiti, kidnapping is not something native to Haiti. Suicide bombings were never native to Palestine or any other Muslim or Arab land. These were a weapon of the oppressed to resist F-16 jets that were dropping bombs from all over. So there's a similar modern context in Haiti to these kidnappings. For the missionaries, they're demanding 1 million per missionary. They're not demanding 1,000, which would be realistic if it was coming from just everyday, quote unquote, isolated youth gang members. There's a whole hierarchy that goes up to the Aped family and the Boulos family. These are the Rockefellers up in the mountains of Pétionville. So these are super well organized. It's connected to paramilitary entities. The antecedents were the Tonton Macoutes and the Frappe. So we know where the guns come from. The same question that Nino Brown asked in New Jack City, to bring it back to Jackie's film critiques, like none of the Uzis were made in Harlem and they weren't made in Haiti. There's 500,000 illegal guns there. Where do all these drugs come from? There's no history of drug use in Haitian culture. And then of course, these paramilitary Colombians, 26 Colombian paramilitaries who were part of the ambush on Jovenel Moise, and then 2 former agents of the DEA. I mean, this should be un bombazo. This should be front page news all day, every day. They got caught. The smoking gun is right there in our face, and we never even hear about this.
Cool, thank you, Danny. We have a couple of different questions that are kind of similar. Like Netfa's question about Americanism, Ajamu Baraka asked about how does Jackie see Hollywood supporting the growing anti-Chinese line coming from the state? Jackie, do you want to take that?
I mean, if you watch a lot of television shows like NCIS and all of the propaganda shows, at some point you're going to come across a plot device or a narrative about Chinese hackers creating some type of problem with, U.S. banking system or hacking into the Department of Defense. And I was scrolling on Netflix the other night, I think, and there is, I think, a whole movie about like this apocalypse that China, caused by this enormous hacking device and just crippled the U.S. society and all this. And, China has no reason to do that because China has actually eradicated extreme poverty in their own country, and they're pursuing this plan of shared prosperity in their own country. So why in the world would China want to mess around and hack anything in this country when, this country is not going to do anything about poverty in this country. This country is going to do anything about inequality. But again, it is the anti-communist rhetoric of the US government that we see in mainstream so-called news, which isn't journalism. It's just, the CNN and MSNBC and those outlets, including Fox News, are also, they're just, the media arms of the US empire. But Hollywood is absolutely the propaganda arm of the US empire, with anti-Chinese rhetoric not even seeping in. It's quite blatant in many popular movies and television shows today. So it is very, very obvious and apparent that China is there is a new Cold War against China, and Hollywood and television studios and even streaming studios, they're all in on it with the US empire.
Thank you, Jackie. We have a lot of questions coming through. We're not going to be able to answer them, unfortunately, so we apologize in advance. There were some questions up here about, let me just find it. I'll get back to that. So yeah, that's based, Netfa, you're asking about your question. Your question was similar to the question that Ajahn Baraka asked about. Yours was about Americanism, quote, in quotes, as Malcolm X referred to it. And what can be done to break with it, and how can it be done? So maybe Danny, do you want to take a stab at that? And then Jacqueline, and then myself, and then we'll have to end the question portion.
Yeah, with the date of the anniversary, the 60th anniversary of Frantz Fanon's death coming up, how important to highlight Fanon's contributions, the psychological and emotional and spiritual components of colonialism and neo-colonialism, and that Fanon is more relevant than ever, and how the Black Panthers and the Young Lords and the Rainbow Coalition rolled with Fanon and applied it to the US context. Yeah, the people in power, the bourgeoisie, casts a world in its very image. I was in Costa Rica, and there were these quote unquote Nicaraguan exiles who were, of course, the elites who hate socialism and collectivism. And they kept saying to me, why can't we be like you and the Americans and the gringos? Why can't we be like the Costa Ricans? And, you know, my reply was just, have you ever heard of self-hatred? How can you decontextualize your own national history? So certainly, within the neo-colonies, within Haiti, I always highlight the Haitian resistance, but there's so much internalized Americanism, and people are so trapped in that day-to-day grind, they're not questioning, why is US currency worth 23 of the Mexican currency and 59 of the Dominican currency? We just begin to accept these things as somehow factual, as if it was natural, when we know there's nothing natural about this order. So certainly popular education, we don't live in this unipolar world of 1991, the quote unquote end of history. I taught in Nicaragua in 2005 when Telesur started, and Telesur didn't just start in Caracas, it started in Havana, it started in Montevideo, Uruguay, it started in Buenos Aires. Continental Third Worldist project no longer is 90% of all movies, images, and information created in Japan, the European Union, and of course, the United States. We live in a more pluripolar world today, thanks to the Bolivarian Project, thanks to the Chinese and everything that they've built. And we published at Toward Freedom something on Russia about 2 weeks ago. It's a more dialectical look beyond the propaganda, dismantling the Western propaganda, and RT, and they have their own propaganda too, which is a whole nother conversation. And then with Covert Action, I published a much lengthier piece. So we have to see all these things as dialectical and complex as they are.
Thank you. And Jacqueline, really quick, if you have a minute to just answer Nefa's question about Americanism and how to break it down.
Yeah, I mean, Americanism, especially in entertainment, is always enforced in making everyone who is not American, especially, you know, in films regarding the Black struggle, where there is no connection to international unity. There is no connection of Black people struggling for our liberation here to people on the continent, Africans throughout the diaspora. So we're intentionally isolated as this uniquely American group of Black people who have nothing in common with other folks going through the same struggle for the exact same reasons, capitalism and imperialism. So how do we fight against that? I think there are two things we can do. Number one is we can watch foreign films. That I really do believe that that is helpful, because we see a depiction of other people's struggles and a depiction of history from the perspective that is not US centered. And then also the other way we do that, and I'm actually thinking of a movie that's out now on streaming services that's Korean, called The Battle at Lake Changjin. I actually watched it the other night. It's very, very good. And the New York Times says that that movie is anti-US propaganda, but it is literally how the Koreans won in Korea. It's wild, and it is a very, very good movie. But the other thing we need to do is join an organization to get the kind of structured political education that we need to combat these narratives and to spot them when we see them, because we won't know, most people don't know that they are being propagandized by their favorite movies. So political education, and watch entertainment that's not produced in the US or honestly by any of the US allies.
Thank you, Jackie. And I would just briefly say to combat Americanism is if you can afford it, if there's an opportunity to get out of this country, to see other places, and of course, join an organization. Don't rely on the only way you're going to be able to develop a critical eye on the media in general and on the context in the United States is to be a part of a radical organization that constantly keeps you on your toes about how to look at things. So that would be that. That's all we can do right now in terms of questions. We're very sorry we couldn't answer all of your questions that kept coming through.
Just wow, Danny and Jacqueline and Julie, what an amazing, amazing presentation of so many ideas. Like there's just almost too much, but luckily this is recorded. We can go back, review it. We can go back, read your writings at towardfreedom.org. Just thank you so much. So just last night, just quickly, we're so fortunate here in Ho-Chunk territory in Madison, Wisconsin, to have an independent video store that has DVDs, Blu-rays, and VHS tapes. And my family watched Salt to the Earth last night, which was a film that was a 1953 film about intersectional struggle for women's and Latinx minor struggle. And this, at our local independent video store, they have a whole section of films that were banned or slammed for being communist. So when you have independent media and independent media outlets, you have much more access to the real stories of the people on the ground. And that's what Toward Freedom has been bringing you for 69 years. Robin Lloyd was Bill Lloyd's daughter and was with him in the decolonizing Africa, taking all of those trips with him to visit movement leaders and heads of state. She's a filmmaker. She's made films in Haiti. She's a new grandma. And she comes from several generations of editors and writers. And she took over stewardship of Toward Freedom in the 80s when her dad retired. So she's been with the organization through many ups and downs and oversaw the transition from print to online 15 years ago. And she's here to just talk to us about what we need from readers, what we need from writers, what we need from hopefully potentially new board members. If you're interested in our organization, get in touch with us because we really, really need to expand our board with new voices. So here's Robin.
All right. Yes. Hello, everyone. This has been really quite thrilling. I think Toward Freedom has not had any kind of a Zoom webinar for a number of years. I'm so grateful to Julie and for Danny and Jacqueline and Rebecca to have pulled this together, and that we have such a good audience. It's wonderful to see all my friends and new people on the list there. Toward Freedom has really has a shoestring budget, so you can see where I'm going with this. We have one person, and that's Julie, on our staff as a program person. But our focus is especially bringing in new writers, helping them craft their articles and paying them for it. And I think that's really such an important aspect of our work, to empower people from the developing world. I mean, for example, some people, it was Greg Guma was editor when we brought in Sasha Abramsky. Do you all remember him? And he's gone on to write now for The Nation and writing books and so on. And we were one of the publications that really got him started. And Charlotte Dennett, who was the interim editor before Julie, also brought in new writers like Eric Agnero from the Ivory Coast and Charles Wachira from Uganda, and work closely with them to develop their stories. So what I'm saying is that you should please go to the chat. I believe it's in the chat that you will find information on how you can donate. And we would love it if you wanted to give what do you call it, a recurring contribution or a one-time contribution, fine too. And so that we can do this again and do more of this and reach out to a larger public. I mean, that we had 70 folks on this call, that was wonderful, but I really hope we will start a series of webinars. Frankly, I found this one, and I've been on a lot of webinars on the issue of mainly on nuclear weapons and so on. I found this one really quite stimulating. So thank you all, and I hope you are putting your name into the chat and that you are figuring out how to donate either online, or there is an address where you can write a check to Toward Freedom, 300 Maple Street, Burlington, Vermont. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to just a second. All right. So as you heard from Robin, we have. We thank everybody for joining this webinar, and for, if you want to donate, if you have the capacity to donate, you can go to towardfreedom.org/donate, and you can keep up with us on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, and you can sign up for our newsletter on our website as well. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you share this on Facebook, because the Facebook live stream is live right now, and it will be there after this event is over. And I thank you so much for your time.
Julie, I'd just like to thank Julio and Adriana from the Interpreters Cooperative for providing Spanish interpretation this evening. I'd like to thank the Afro Yaqui Music Collective for allowing us to use their amazing music. Check them out if you don't know them already. They're doing some really avant-garde, but also just super beautiful liberation music. And thanks again for coming.